The rain against the single-pane windows of St. Jude Academy in 1995 did not sound like weather. It sounded like static, a relentless, gray hiss that sealed the occupants of room 304 inside a vacuum of high-pressure expectations. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of damp wool, floor wax, and the distinct, dry scent of chalk dust. To the 30 sophomores sitting in rigid rows, the wooden desks were not furniture but life rafts, and the man standing at the front of the room was the storm itself. Arthur Penden did not merely occupy space. He annexed it. At 45, he was already an institution within the brick walls of the private school, a man carved from granite and tweed. He stood with his back to the class, his arm elevated, the muscles beneath his jacket shifting as he drove a piece of white chalk against the slate. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The sound was rhythmic, percussive, and terrifying. When he stopped writing, the silence that followed was so absolute that the scratching of a tree branch against the glass sounded like a scream. He turned slowly. His eyes, magnified slightly by wire-rimmed spectacles, swept across the room like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, searching for a ship to wreck. History, Arthur said, his voice a baritone rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards, is not a collection of dates. It is a ledger of choices. It is the accounting of blood and ambition. He walked down the center aisle, his shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum. The students held their breath. To breathe was to draw attention. To draw attention was to court disaster. And in this room you do not memorize history. You survive it. He stopped at the third row. He did not look down immediately. He let the tension build, a master conductor of anxiety. Finally, his gaze dropped to the boy sitting in the second seat from the left. The boy was small for his age, with messy brown hair and a collar that seemed too large for his neck. He was staring at his textbook as if hoping to dissolve into the paper. "Mr. King," Arthur said. Marcus King flinched. The reaction was visceral, a physical recoil as if he had been struck. He looked up, his eyes wide and watery, terrified. Why yes, sir? Stand up, Marcus." The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a jagged noise that made several students wince. Marcus stood. His hands were trembling. He gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned the color of old parchment. "Page 42, Arthur commanded, walking back toward the blackboard, putting distance between them, forcing Marcus to project. "The passage on the fall of Rome. Read it." Loudly. The class shifted uncomfortably. They knew this ritual. They knew Marcus. In the cafeteria, Marcus was the ghost, the boy who ate sandwiches alone to avoid having to ask for a seat. In room 304, he was the prey. Marcus looked down at the text. The words swam before him: corruption, infrastructure, barbarians, clustering together into an insurmountable wall. He opened his mouth. His jaw locked. The DDD. A snicker rippled from the back of the room. It came from Brad Thorne, the captain of the junior varsity football team, a boy whose confidence was inversely proportional to his empathy. The snicker grew into a stifled laugh. Arthur whipped around. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply held up a single finger. The laughter died instantly in Brad's throat, replaced by a sudden, dry swallow. Arthur turned his attention back to the trembling boy. The DD decline. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, his face flushing a deep, painful crimson. Of the RRO. "Stop," Arthur said. Marcus slumped, defeated. He looked ready to cry, ready to sit down and accept the F, ready to accept that he was broken. "I CC can't, sir. I'm SS sorry." "Did I tell you to sit?" Arthur asked. "And no. Then remain standing." Arthur walked back down the aisle, moving with a predator's grace until he stood directly in front of Marcus. He loomed over the boy, blocking out the light from the windows. The rest of the class watched in horror, expecting the explosion, the humiliation. Arthur Penden was known for his ruthlessness. He was the teacher who failed the mayor's son because the boy hadn't read the Odyssey. He was the man who gave detention for split infinitives. Arthur leaned down, placing both hands on Marcus's desk, leaning into the boy's personal space. "Look at me, Mr. King." Marcus forced his eyes up. He was shaking violently. "Do you know why you stutter, Marcus?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Marcus and the eavesdropping students in the immediate radius could hear. Because I'm so stupid?" "Incorrect," Arthur snapped, the volume returning. "You stutter because your mind is a Ferrari and your mouth is a bicycle. Your thoughts are moving faster than your tongue can clutch the gears." Marcus blinked, confused. This was not the insult he had braced for. "You are trying to vomit the entire sentence at once." Arthur continued, his face inches from the boy's. "You see the end of the paragraph before you have spoken the first word. You are anxious to please, anxious to finish, anxious to run away." Arthur straightened up, addressing the whole room now. "Panic is the enemy of intellect. Speed is the enemy of precision." He turned back to Marcus. "You will not sit down until you read that sentence. But you will not read it at your pace. You will read it at mine." Arthur pulled a metronome from his jacket pocket, a small, mechanical device used for music. He set it on Marcus's desk and wound it. Click, 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 click. The tempo was agonizingly slow. "One word," Arthur ordered. "Per beat. No faster. If you rush, we start over. If you stutter, we start over. Breathe." Marcus looked at the metronome. The ticking was hypnotic. Marcus said. "Click." "Decline," Marcus said. "Click. Of. Click." Click. "Roman." Click. "Empire." Again, Arthur ordered. "Next sentence." Was. Marcus breathed, sweat beading on his forehead. "Not." Click. A. Click. Single. Click. Event. For 10 minutes the class sat frozen. It was excruciating. It was a torture of seconds. But slowly the rhythm took over. Marcus's breathing synced with the machine. The stutter dissolved not because he was cured, but because he was forced to slow down to construct the architecture of the sentence brick by brick. When he finished the paragraph, the room was silent. Marcus looked up, exhausted, as if he had just run a marathon. He looked at Arthur, waiting for the criticism. Arthur picked up the metronome and silenced it. "Your mind is a weapon, Mr. King," he said, his face unreadable. "Learn to aim it before you pull the trigger. Sit down." Marcus sat. He didn't smile. Arthur Penden's class was not a place for smiles. But for the first time in his life, his shoulders weren't hunched up to his ears. The bell rang, a shrill interruption to the atmosphere. As the students scrambled to pack their bags, desperate to escape to the freedom of the hallway, Arthur's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Thorne, stay." Elias Thorne, the boy who had sat in the back with his arms crossed and a scowl etched permanently onto his face, froze. Elias was the opposite of Marcus. Where Marcus was liquid fear, Elias was solid rage. He was a scholarship kid from the South Side, the son of a mechanic who drank too much and a mother who worked 2 shifts. He wore his uniform like a prison jumpsuit, untucked and stained. He had been in 3 fights since the semester began. The room emptied. Elias slouched up to the front desk, his jaw set in a defiant jut. "I didn't do nothin', Penden." "Anything," Arthur corrected, not looking up from his papers. "You didn't do anything, and that is precisely the problem." He slid a test paper across the desk. It was covered in red ink. A score of 42 sat circled in the corner. Elias glanced at it and scoffed. "So? I failed. Big deal. Kick me out. Save us both the time." Arthur stood up, bypassing the desk to lean against the blackboard. He crossed his arms, studying Elias with a clinical detachment that infuriated the boy. "You want me to expel you, don't you, Elias? It would be easier. Then you could go back to the narrative you've written for yourself. The victim. The system is rigged. The rich kids win, the poor kid loses. The system is rigged." Elias spat, his hands balling into fists. "You think I care about Rome? You think I care about the French Revolution? I got real problems." "I know," Arthur said. "I saw your father pick you up yesterday. I saw the bruise on your arm last week. Elias went still. The rage faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp vulnerability, which he quickly covered with more aggression. Shut up. You don't know me. I know that you have the highest aptitude for geometry and spatial reasoning in the sophomore class, Arthur said calmly. I know that when you actually turned in your biology lab, your dissection was surgical in its precision. You have hands that understand how things are built and how they are taken apart. Arthur walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a bucket and a scrub brush. He dropped them at Elias's feet. What's this? Elias asked. My car needs washing, Arthur lied. But it's raining. So instead, you are going to scrub the floor of this classroom. Every inch. Under the desks. In the corners. I ain't your janitor. No, you are currently a failing student on the verge of expulsion, Arthur said. You have detention with me every afternoon for the next month. You can sit there and stare at the wall, or you can scrub the floor and think about why you are throwing away a gift that 90% of the people on this planet would kill for. I'm not smart, Elias muttered, looking at his boots. Arthur grabbed Elias's shoulder. His grip was surprisingly strong. Intelligence is not knowing the answer, Elias. Intelligence is the refusal to give up until you find it. You are angry. Good. Use the anger. Scrub the floor until you're too tired to be angry at the world, and then use what's left to do your geometry homework. Elias stared at the bucket. He hated this man. He hated this school. But he hated the look in his father's eyes more. He picked up the brush. The weeks turned into months, and the rain turned to snow, and then to the slush of early spring. Room 304 remained a fortress. It was the one place in the school where money didn't matter. In Mr. Penden's class, your father's donation to the gymnasium fund could not buy you a passing grade. There was Sarah Jenkins, a girl so shy she seemed to vibrate at a frequency invisible to the naked eye. She sat in the front row, diligent, silent, terrified of being seen. One afternoon in March, Arthur had assigned an oral debate on the ethics of the atomic bomb. Sarah had been paired against the captain of the debate team. When it was her turn to speak, she whispered. I can't hear you, Miss Jenkins, Arthur had said from the back of the room. I said, the moral implication. Louder. The moral implication. Stand on the chair, Arthur commanded. The class gasped. Sarah looked horrified. Sir. Stand on the chair, Sarah. Only when you are taller than your fear will you be able to speak over it. She had climbed onto the wooden chair, shaking, her knees knocking together. From that vantage point, she looked down at her classmates. She looked at Arthur, who stood with his arms crossed, nodding encouragingly. And she spoke. She didn't shout, but she projected. She dismantled her opponent's argument with a logic so cold and precise that the room erupted in spontaneous applause when she finished. Arthur didn't clap. He just marked an A in his ledger and said, You may step down, Senator. The floor is yours. He called her Senator for the rest of the year. This was the ecosystem of Arthur Penden. It was harsh. It was devoid of the coddling that was beginning to seep into the education system even then. He didn't offer gold stars for participation. He offered the truth. He tore them down, stripping away the entitlement of the wealthy and the self-pity of the poor, until only the raw material remained. And then he built them back up. The final day of the school year in 1995 came with a blaze of sunshine that felt unearned. The classroom was empty, stripped of the posters and the projects. The chalkboard was washed clean, leaving only the ghostly swirls of erased equations and dates. Marcus, Elias, and Sarah lingered at the door. They were different now. Marcus stood straighter. Elias wore his uniform shirt tucked in. His hands were rough from scrubbing floors, but his geometry grade was a B+. Sarah looked people in the eye. Mr. Penden? Marcus asked. He didn't stutter. Arthur looked up from his desk, where he was organizing his grade book for the summer archive. Mr. King, you are going to miss your bus. We just wanted to say. Marcus paused, searching for the words. Thank you. Arthur adjusted his glasses. He didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes crinkled, a microscopic betrayal of emotion. You earned your grades. I gave you nothing. You gave us a hard time. Elias grinned, leaning against the doorframe. Life will give you harder times, Mr. Thorne, Arthur said, closing the ledger with a definitive thud. I merely provided the rehearsal. He watched them leave. He watched them walk down the hallway, laughing, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, stepping out into the summer and into their futures. He stood at the window and watched until the buses pulled away, disappearing into the heat haze. Arthur Penden stayed in room 304. He stayed as the years began to accelerate, slipping by like frames in a film reel speeding out of control. 1995 bled into 2000. The chalkboard turned into a whiteboard. The overhead projector was replaced by a digital throw. The heavy textbooks vanished, replaced by iPads. The uniforms changed styles. The haircuts changed. The slang became indecipherable. But Arthur remained. He was the constant variable in an equation of chaos. His hair turned from salt and pepper to the white of fresh snow. His walk slowed, the sharp click of his heels softening into a shuffle. The administration changed, too. The old headmaster, a man who understood the value of rigor, retired. He was replaced, and then replaced again, until the office was occupied by Principal Sterling, a man who spoke in buzzwords, who cared more about customer satisfaction and brand optics than the molding of character. The world outside the windows of St. Jude moved on. It became digital, fast, and unforgiving in a new way. It was a world that didn't have time for metronomes or hand-scrubbed floors. It was a world that viewed Arthur Penden not as a titan, but as a glitch. And so we arrive at the rain again, 30 years later. The rain still sounded like static, but the glass was now double-paned and soundproofed, muffling the noise of the storm. Room 304 was different. It was sleek, sterile, and filled with the blue light of 30 tablet screens. Arthur Penden stood at the front, holding a piece of chalk that he had brought from home, because the school no longer supplied it. He looked at the smartboard, a black, soulless mirror reflecting his own aging face. He turned to the class. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at their screens, scrolling, tapping, disengaged. Put the devices away, Arthur said. His voice was older, raspier, but the steel was still there buried under the gravel. We need them for the module, Mr. Penden, a girl in the front row said without looking up, popping a piece of gum. The syllabus says. I don't care what the syllabus says, Arthur snapped, snatching the tablet from her hand. I am teaching you about the Great Depression. You cannot understand hunger by looking at a pixelated picture of a breadline. The door to the classroom opened. It wasn't a student. It was Principal Sterling, flanked by 2 security guards. He was wearing a slim-fit suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He held a tablet in his hands, his thumb hovering over a digital document. Arthur, Sterling said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. Could we have a word? Outside. Arthur looked at the chalk in his hand. He looked at the confused, annoyed faces of the students who viewed him as a relic. He looked at Sterling. He felt a sudden, cold premonition in his chest, sharper than the damp air of 1995. The rehearsal was over. The real storm had finally broken through the glass. The hallway leading to the administrative wing of St. Jude Academy was a tunnel of glass and polished terrazzo, designed less like a school corridor and more like the artery of a high-end tech firm. Arthur Penden walked down the center of it, his heels clicking a slow, funereal rhythm that echoed off the trophy cases. He was flanked by 2 security guards, men with necks as thick as tree stumps and earpieces coiling down their collars like plastic parasites. They didn't touch him, but their presence was a cage. Arthur kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the trophies. He knew them by heart. He knew the stories behind the gold-plated cups and the framed certificates. He knew that the 1998 debate championship trophy had a dent on the back where the team captain had dropped it in excitement. He knew that the state science fair ribbon from 2003 belonged to a girl who was currently mapping the human genome in Geneva. These were not just objects to him. They were fossils of the lives he had helped excavate. But to the administration, they were just marketing materials, shiny objects to dazzle prospective parents during open house tours. When they reached the double doors of the principal's office, the guards stopped. One of them, a man named Miller who had once been a student in Arthur's detention 20 years ago, looked down at his boots, unable to meet the old teacher's gaze. "Sorry, Mr. Penden," Miller mumbled, his voice thick with a shame he couldn't articulate. "Just doing the job." "I know, Miller," Arthur said softly, adjusting the cuffs of his tweed jacket. "The job always comes first these days." "Open the door." Inside, the office smelled of espresso and ozone. Principal Sterling sat behind a desk that looked like a slice of a stealth bomber, black, angular, and devoid of paper. The walls were transparent, offering a panoramic view of the manicured campus lawn where automatic sprinklers hissed in the gray afternoon light. Sterling didn't stand up when Arthur entered. He didn't offer a hand. He simply gestured to a low, uncomfortable chair made of molded plastic. "Sit, Arthur," Sterling said. He was a man of 40, smooth-skinned and manicured, wearing a suit that shimmered slightly under the LED recessed lighting. He swiped a finger across his tablet, dismissing a notification before locking his eyes on the old teacher. "We have a problem." Arthur remained standing. "I imagine we do, considering I was pulled from my classroom in the middle of a lecture on the economic collapse of 1929. Ironically fitting, don't you think?" Sterling sighed, a sharp exhale through his nose. He hated Arthur's wit. He hated the way the old man spoke in complete paragraphs, as if life were a novel that needed to be narrated. "This isn't a joke, Arthur. We received a call from the Board of Trustees 20 minutes ago. It concerns the grade you gave to Julian Vane." "Julian Vane," Arthur nodded slowly. "The boy who believes the capital of France is Europe. I gave him an F. It was generous. He deserved a 0 for writing his essay with a chatbot." "Julian Vane is the son of Carter Vane," Sterling said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Carter Vane, who just pledged $3 million for the new esports arena. Do you understand the economics here, Arthur? You failed a $3 million investment." "I failed a student who refused to learn," Arthur corrected, his voice rising. "I am a teacher, Mr. Sterling. I deal in knowledge, not currency. If Julian wants an A, he can open a book. If his father wants to buy him a grade, he can send him to a store, not a school." Sterling stood up then, slamming his hand flat on the desk. The sound was dull and heavy. "This is a school, Arthur, but it is also a business. We are bleeding enrollment to the charter schools downtown. We need that arena. We need the tech upgrades. We cannot afford your antique morality." He walked around the desk, approaching Arthur like a lawyer closing in on a witness. "It's not just Vane. It's the complaints. The parents say you're rigid. They say you're traumatizing the students with your cold-calling methods. You made a girl cry last week because she didn't know the preamble to the Constitution. She cried because she realized she didn't know it," Arthur said, holding his ground. "Discomfort is the first step of growth. If we protect them from every moment of struggle, we aren't raising leaders. We're raising victims. We are raising consumers." Sterling shouted, losing his composure for a split second before smoothing his tie. "And the customer is always right. You don't fit here anymore, Arthur. Look at you. You're wearing a jacket from the Nixon administration. You write on a blackboard that creates dust in a clean air environment. You refuse to use the grading app because you prefer a physical ledger. You are a bottleneck in our workflow." Sterling walked back to his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. It was heavy, cream-colored stock, embossed with the school seal. "The board has voted. Effective immediately, your contract is terminated with cause. The cause being insubordination and failure to adhere to pedagogical standards." Arthur looked at the paper. He didn't take it. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "Terminated." It sounded like something you did to a pest or a virus. 30 years, Arthur whispered. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, crushing exhaustion. "I have given this school 30 years of my life. I have taught over 5,000 students. I have stayed late to tutor the ones who couldn't read. I have bought lunch for the ones who couldn't eat. And you're firing me for an F? We're letting you go because you refuse to evolve, Sterling said, placing the paper on the edge of the desk. Security will escort you to collect your personal effects. You have until 3 p.m. to vacate the premises. That gives you 20 minutes. Arthur looked at the man. He saw no regret in Sterling's eyes, only the cold calculation of a spreadsheet balancer who had just removed a red cell. Arthur reached out and took the paper. His hand didn't shake. He folded it neatly once, twice, and placed it in his breast pocket next to his fountain pen. You are building an arena, Sterling, Arthur said quietly, turning to the door. But you are forgetting that the Romans built the Colosseum to distract the people while the empire burned. Be careful you don't burn with it. He walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing off the scent of espresso and betrayal. The walk back to room 304 felt like a hallucination. The bell had rung, and the hallways were flooding with the chaos of the class change. Students surged around him, a river of navy blue blazers and khaki skirts. They were loud, their faces buried in phones, their laughter shrill and disconnected. Arthur moved through them like a ghost. No one looked at him. No one noticed the security guards trailing him. He was already invisible. He entered his classroom. It was empty now, save for the faint chalk dust settling on the floor in the afternoon sunbeams. It was a room that had contained the universe for him. He walked to his desk, a heavy oak beast that he had refused to trade for the lightweight standing desks the school had issued 5 years ago. He opened the bottom drawer. It squeaked, a familiar sound that felt like a greeting. He pulled out a cardboard box. It was an old-produced box from a grocery store, stamped with a logo for bananas. He had kept it folded there for years, though he had never truly believed he would need it. He began to pack. First, the mug. It was white ceramic, chipped at the rim, with the words "World's Best Teacher" fading in red block letters. Sarah Jenkins had given it to him in 1995. She had saved her lunch money for 2 weeks to buy it. He wrapped it carefully in a few tissues from the dispenser on his desk. Next, the books. A first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, its spine cracked and soft. A copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, filled with his own handwritten notes in the margins. These were his friends, his co-teachers. He laid them in the box like sleeping children. Then the framed photograph. He picked it up and wiped a layer of dust from the glass. It was the class of '95. They were standing on the front steps of the old library building, squinting in the sun. There was Marcus, looking terrified even in a still photo. There was Elias, looking angry. There was Sarah, looking small. He traced their faces with his thumb. They were the masterpiece he had helped sculpt. Where were they now? He knew, of course. He read about them in the papers. But did they remember him? Or was he just a footnote in their biographies, the strict old man who made them cry before they became great? He placed the photo face down in the box. Finally, the chalk. A small wooden box of Hagoromo full-touch chalk, the Rolls-Royce of chalks. He had imported it himself from Japan because the school only bought the cheap, brittle kind that scratched the board. He ran his fingers over the smooth, white cylinders. They were weapons of mass construction. He closed the lid and tucked it into the corner of the box. That was it. 30 years of service reduced to 12 pounds of cardboard. Mr. Penden? Arthur looked up. Miller, the security guard, was standing in the doorway. It's time, sir. Sterling wants you off the grounds before the parents start arriving for pickup. I'm ready, Miller, Arthur said. He lifted the box. Felt heavier than it should have. He walked out of the classroom. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he knew he would break down, and he would not give Sterling the satisfaction of seeing him weep. The journey to the exit was a public execution. The hallway was crowded now. Word had spread, news moved at the speed of light on social media. Penden is fired. The dinosaur is extinct. As he walked, a hush fell over the students nearest to him, rippling outward. But it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of the zoo. They watched him. Phones were raised. Lenses were pointed. He could see himself on their screens, a small, gray figure clutching a banana box. Is he crying? Someone whispered. Finally got rid of him. Another voice sneered. Hey, Mr. Penden, say cheese. A boy shouted, followed by a burst of laughter. Arthur kept his head high. Character, he told himself. Character is what you do when the world is watching and you want to disappear. He fixed his eyes on the exit doors at the end of the long corridor. They were the finish line. Just 50 more steps. 40. 30. He passed the trophy case again. He saw his own reflection in the glass. A tired old man in a suit that didn't fit the times. He looked away. The automatic doors slid open. The air that hit him was wet and biting. It had been sunny earlier, but the weather in New England turned on a dime, and a cold, driving rain had swept in from the coast. Arthur stepped out onto the sidewalk. The overhang provided some shelter, but the wind whipped the rain sideways, stinging his face. The security guards stopped at the threshold. Their jurisdiction ended at the door. Good luck, Mr. Penden, Miller said. And this time he sounded like he meant it. The doors slid shut. Arthur was alone. He walked out into the parking lot. The rain soaked his hair instantly, plastering it to his skull. It darkened the shoulders of his tweed jacket. Water seeped into his shoes. He shivered, clutching the box to his chest to protect the books inside. He looked for his car, a rusted 2010 sedan that sat in the far corner of the lot, away from the shiny BMWs and Range Rovers of the faculty and students. It looked like a heap of scrap metal in the gray light. He reached the car and fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline crash. He dropped the keys in a puddle. Damn it, he whispered, his voice cracking. Damn it all. He stooped to pick them up, his knees popping. As he straightened, he looked back at the school. The massive brick facade of St. Jude Academy loomed over him, indifferent and imposing. Lights were coming on in the windows, warm and inviting, shutting him out. He saw figures moving behind the glass. Teachers preparing lessons, students laughing. The machine continued without him. He had been a cog, and he had been replaced. A tear hot and salty, mixed with the cold rain on his cheek. He wiped it away angrily. He was Arthur Penden. He did not cry. He opened the car door and tossed the box onto the passenger seat. He was about to get in, to drive away and never return, to go home to his empty apartment and figure out how to live the rest of his life as a redundant artifact. But then the ground trembled. At first he thought it was thunder. The storm was intensifying, but the vibration wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the asphalt beneath his feet. The puddles around his shoes began to ripple in concentric circles. A deep, low thrumming sound filled the air, growing louder, deeper, more aggressive. It was the sound of horsepower, raw, expensive, precision-engineered horsepower. Arthur turned toward the main gate. Through the curtain of rain, lights appeared. Not the yellow, dim lights of school buses or the erratic beams of parent pickups. These were xenon blue, piercing and sharp as lasers. A black SUV tore through the open gates. It was massive. A Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows and chrome rims that flashed like lightning. It didn't slow down for the speed bumps. It devoured them. Behind it, another one. And another. Then a Rolls-Royce Phantom, its massive grille parting the rain like the prow of a battleship. Then a Bentley Flying Spur. Then a Maybach. It was a cavalcade of power. A fleet of titans. They moved in a formation that was almost military, sweeping into the circular driveway in front of the school, blocking the lanes, blocking the buses, blocking the world. Arthur stood frozen, his hands still on the door handle of his rusted sedan. He watched as the convoy ground to a halt. The engines didn't cut. They idled, a collective growl that drowned out the rain. The door of the lead Rolls-Royce opened. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out, ignoring the downpour, and opened the rear door. A shoe hit the wet pavement. Black leather, polished to a mirror shine, Italian craftsmanship. A man emerged. He stood up, buttoning a suit jacket that cost more than Arthur's car. He didn't use an umbrella. He let the rain hit him, unbothered, as if the elements themselves bowed to his authority. Arthur squinted. The figure was familiar. the posture upright, confident, but with a slight, almost imperceptible leaning to the left. The man turned. He looked across the expanse of the parking lot, scanning the area until his eyes locked on the soaked, shivering figure of the old teacher standing by the rusted sedan. The man began to walk toward him. He didn't run. He walked with purpose, closing the distance with long, steady strides. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that walk. He had taught that boy how to walk that way, how to stop hunching, how to occupy space. Marcus, Arthur whispered, the name catching in his throat. The man stopped 3 feet away. The rain ran down his face, but he was smiling. It was a smile that could buy and sell companies. But in his eyes, there was the same terrified, stuttering boy from 1995. "Hello, Mr. Penden," Marcus King said. His voice was smooth, a rich baritone without a single hitch. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but we wanted to make sure we had their attention." Arthur stared at him, bewildered. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the convoy. The other doors were opening now. Sarah Jenkins stepped out of the Bentley, her sharp features softened by a look of fierce determination. Elias Thorne emerged from the Escalade, now a giant of a man, his hands, once bruised from fighting, now the hands of a surgeon who saved lives daily. They gathered behind Marcus, a phalanx of success standing in the pouring rain. Marcus turned back to Arthur. "We heard you were leaving, sir, and we decided that if you were going, we were going to make sure you didn't go alone." I was fired, Marcus," Arthur said, the shame washing over him again. "I have nothing left here." Marcus shook his head. He reached out and gently took the wet cardboard box from the passenger seat of Arthur's car. He held it like it was filled with gold bars. "You have everything here, sir," Marcus said, his voice hard as steel. "You built this, and we are here to make sure they remember who owns the foundation." He looked up at the school windows, where faces were now pressed against the glass, watching the spectacle. "Shall we go inside?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the main entrance with his free hand. "I believe you have a meeting with Mr. Sterling, and this time you're bringing your own board of directors." The automatic doors of St. Jude Academy hissed open for the second time in 10 minutes. But this time, the atmosphere was not one of exit, but of invasion. The storm outside had turned the sky a bruised purple, casting long, liquid shadows across the marble floor of the main atrium. Arthur Penden walked in first, his tweed jacket heavy with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, clutching the soggy cardboard box against his chest like a shield. He felt small, a ghost returning to haunt a house that had already exorcised him. But he was not alone. Flanking him were 3 figures who seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Marcus King, on his right, moved with the kinetic energy of a coiled spring. The water dripping from his bespoke suit didn't make him look disheveled. It made him look elemental, like a statue carved from obsidian and left in the rain. To his left walked Sarah Jenkins, her heels striking the floor with the precision of a gavel, her eyes scanning the perimeter for threats she had already calculated how to neutralize. Behind them, a silent monolith, was Elias Thorne, his broad shoulders blocking out the view of the parking lot, his presence a physical wall between Arthur and the world that had tried to discard him. The lobby was quiet for a heartbeat. The receptionist, Miss Gable, a woman who had worked at St. Jude for 5 years and prided herself on knowing the license plate of every donor, dropped her phone. It clattered against the desk, a sharp plastic crack that echoed in the silence. She stared. She didn't look at Arthur. She looked at Marcus. She recognized him not from the yearbook, but from the cover of Wired magazine she had read in the break room that morning. Mr. King?" she stammered, half rising from her chair. Marcus didn't stop. He didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the double mahogany doors at the end of the hall, the doors to the boardroom where the board of trustees held their quarterly strategy meetings. He knew they were there. He had checked the school's digital calendar before he even got out of the car. "Security," Ms. Gable squeaked, fumbling for her radio. "Code. I don't know the code. Just get here." 2 guards rounded the corner. Miller and his partner, distinct from the ones who had escorted Arthur out. They saw the group and their hands instinctively went to their belts, not for weapons, but for the reassuring bulk of their flashlights. They stepped forward to block the path. "Hold it right there," the lead guard barked. "This is private property. You can't." Elias stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hands. He simply moved into the guard's space, towering over him by 6 inches. "We are going to the boardroom," Elias said. His voice was a deep rumble, calm and terrifyingly polite. "You can try to stop us, but I am a neurosurgeon. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to dislocate a shoulder without causing permanent damage. Do you have health insurance that covers out-of-network specialists?" The guard blinked. He looked at Elias's hands, large, steady, and terrifyingly relaxed. He looked at the expensive suits. He looked at Arthur Penden, who was staring at the floor. The calculation took less than a second. "Boardroom is down the hall, second door on the left," the guard said, stepping aside. "Thank you," Elias said, adjusting his wet tie. They continued the march. The hallway was filling up now. Students were spilling out of classrooms for the afternoon dismissal, their laughter and chatter dying instantly as they saw the procession. The exiles, as they had been known 30 years ago, were cutting a swath through the crowd. Phones were raised again, but the jeers were gone. There was a recognition rippling through the student body, a viral realization jumping from screen to screen. "That's Marcus King," a boy whispered, clutching his tablet. "He owns the platform we're streaming on." "Is that Senator Jenkins?" a girl asked, her eyes wide. "She was on the news yesterday yelling at the president." "Who's the big guy?" "That's Dr. Thorne. He did the surgery on the quarterback for the Patriots." Arthur heard the whispers. He felt like he was walking through a dream. These titans, these people who shaped the world, were forming a phalanx around him, the man with the banana box. He wanted to tell them to stop, to go back to their lives, to not waste their capital on a washed-up teacher. But his throat was tight, constricting with a mixture of grief and an overwhelming, confusing pride. They reached the mahogany doors. Marcus didn't knock. He placed his hand flat against the wood and pushed. Inside, the air was climate-controlled and smelled of expensive cologne. Around the oval table sat 12 people, the board of trustees. At the head of the table stood Principal Sterling, holding a laser pointer, mid-sentence in a presentation about maximizing tuition revenue through tiered enrollment packages. Behind him, a projection screen displayed a graph with a sharp upward curve. The door banged open against the stopper. Every head turned. Sterling froze. The laser pointer jittered on the screen, a frantic red dot dancing over the revenue projection. "What is this?" he demanded, his face flushing with indignation. "You cannot simply barge in here. Security. Security has been advised to stand down," Marcus said, walking into the room. He didn't stop until he reached the opposite end of the table, directly facing Sterling. He placed his hands on the polished wood. Water dripped from his cuffs, leaving dark spots on the pristine surface. "Marcus King," Sterling said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He recognized the man immediately. Everyone did. Sterling's indignation wavered, replaced by a flicker of calculated charm. "Mr. King, I wasn't aware you were visiting. We could have arranged a tour. We are very proud of our STEM wing, largely inspired by your—" "I'm not here for a tour, Sterling," Marcus interrupted. His voice was quiet, devoid of the stutter that had once silenced him in this very building. It was the voice of a man who commanded algorithms that shifted global markets. "I'm here for a board meeting. This is a closed session." A board member to the right spoke up, Carter Vane. The father of the boy Arthur had failed. Vane was a heavy-set man in a pinstripe suit, his face red with exertion. "You have no standing here, King. I don't care how many apps you sell. Get out." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from behind Marcus. She didn't look wet. She looked anointed. She placed a leather briefcase on the table and snapped the latches open. The sound was like 2 gunshots in the quiet room. "Actually, Mr. Vane," Sarah said, pulling out a sheaf of documents. Standing is exactly what we have. She slid a document down the center of the table. It spun perfectly, coming to rest in front of Sterling. "What is this?" Sterling asked, picking it up. "That," Sarah said, "is a notice of acquisition. As of 2:15 p.m. today, Aurora Holdings purchased 51% of the Class A voting shares of the St. Jude Educational Trust." The room erupted. "That's impossible," Vane shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "The trust is private. The shares aren't liquid. They were held by 3 shell companies in the Caymans and 1 very cash-poor venture fund in Delaware," Marcus said calmly. "I bought the debt of the Delaware fund at 2:05 p.m. I exercised the call options on the Cayman shares at 2:10 p.m. The wire transfers cleared at 2:14 p.m. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than the room's audiovisual system. "I have owned this school for approximately 45 minutes. I apologize for being late to my first meeting. Traffic was murder." Silence descended on the room. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The board members looked at each other, their eyes darting back and forth, mentally calculating their own exposures. Sterling looked at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at Marcus, his face pale. You bought a school," Sterling whispered. "Because I fired him?" He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur, who was standing quietly by the door, still holding his box. "You spent, God knows how much, tens of millions, for a teacher?" "No." Elias Thorne spoke up from the back. He walked forward, his footsteps heavy. He stood next to Arthur, placing a massive hand on the old man's shoulder. "We didn't buy it for a teacher. We bought it for the standard." Elias looked around the table, making eye contact with every board member. "You people look at this school and you see a balance sheet. You see a factory that turns out Ivy League acceptances so you can brag at your country clubs. You think the product is the diploma." He reached out and gently took the box from Arthur's hands, setting it down on the side table. He then took Arthur's hand, the hand that was stained with chalk, dust, and ink, and held it up. "This is the product," Elias said. 30 years ago, this man found me in the back of a detention hall. I was washing floors. I was going to drop out. I was going to sell drugs because that was the only career path I saw for someone like me. Elias turned his hand over, revealing a faint, jagged scar on his palm. "I got this scar in a knife fight when I was 16. Mr. Penden saw it. He didn't call the police. He didn't expel me. He handed me a biology textbook and told me that if I had steady enough hands to fight, I had steady enough hands to heal." Elias dropped Arthur's hand and leaned over the table, glaring at Vane. "I am the chief of neurosurgery at City General. Last year, I removed a glioblastoma from the brain of a 6-year-old girl. I saved her life. That girl is alive today not because of your tuition fees, and not because of your smartboards. She is alive because Arthur Penden taught me how to focus. He taught me that excellence is not an act, but a habit. And you fired him," Sarah cut in, her voice sharp as a razor. "You fired him for insubordination, for refusing to inflate grades, for refusing to lie." Sterling tried to rally. He straightened his tie, forcing a smile that looked like a rictus of pain. "Look, I understand you are emotional. We all have fond memories of our favorite teachers. But the reality of modern education is complex. We have overheads. You have an audit," Sarah interrupted. She pulled another document from her briefcase. "This is a subpoena. As a sitting state senator, I have requested a full forensic accounting of the St. Jude allocation funds for the last 5 years. Specifically the building fund, which seems to have paid for a lot of consulting fees to a firm owned by your brother-in-law, Mr. Sterling." Sterling went white. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a physical wipe. That is a conflict of interest. You can't use your office for a personal vendetta." "It's not a vendetta," Sarah said, smiling coldly. "It's oversight, and I'm very good at my job. Another thing Mr. Penden taught me, the truth does not mind being questioned. A lie does not like being challenged. Marcus stepped forward again. He looked at the board members. Here is the new reality. Effective immediately, the board is dissolved. I am accepting your resignations. All of you. You can't do that. Vane sputtered. I have rights. My son. Your son, Marcus said, turning his gaze on Vane, will be given the grade he earns. If he fails, he fails. Failure is data, Mr. Vane. Tells you what you don't know. If you buy him an A, you are teaching him that incompetence has no consequence. You are preparing him to be a CEO who bankrupts a company, not one who builds it. Marcus leaned in close to Vane. Do you want your son to be a success? Or do you want him to be a mascot? Because if you want a mascot, buy him a puppy. If you want a man, leave him here. Vane opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Sterling, who was staring at the floor, defeated. Vane stood up, gathered his papers, and walked out of the room without a word. One by one, the other board members followed. They were rich, powerful people, but they knew when they were outgunned. They knew that Marcus King had more money than God, and Sarah Jenkins had the law in her pocket. The room emptied, leaving only Sterling, the alumni, and Arthur. Sterling looked small now. The grand office, the view, the suit. It all seemed to shrink around him. What happens to me? He asked, his voice hollow. You're fired, Marcus said simply. You have 15 minutes to clear your desk. I believe that is the standard protocol you established. Sterling nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He walked to the door, passing Arthur. He paused for a moment, looking at the old teacher. For a second, it looked like he might say something. An apology, an insult, something. But he found nothing. He just shook his head and walked out into the hallway, into the whispers and the cameras of the students he had claimed to lead. The door clicked shut. The silence in the boardroom was different now. It wasn't tense. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons have stopped firing. The air conditioners hummed. The rain lashed against the windows, but inside, it was warm. Arthur Penden stood by the side table, his hand resting on the wet cardboard box. He felt dizzy. He looked at Marcus, then Sarah, then Elias. They were looking at him, their expressions softening, shedding the armor of the CEO, the senator, and the surgeon. They were just kids again. You shouldn't have done that, Arthur said, his voice trembling. The money, the trouble. I'm just an old man. I was ready to go. You were forced to go, Sarah said, walking over and taking his hand. Her hand was warm. There's a difference. But to buy the school? Arthur looked at Marcus. Marcus, that is, it's absurd. It's an investment, Marcus said, shrugging. He walked over to the head of the table, Sterling's spot, and pulled out the high-backed leather chair. He spun it around to face Arthur. Besides, I needed a tax write-off. He smiled, a genuine boyish grin. Sit down, Mr. Penden. I don't want to sit, Arthur said. I want to go home. I want to dry off. Sit down, Elias said gently, guiding Arthur to the chair. Arthur sank into it. It was too soft, too expensive. He felt ridiculous. Marcus leaned against the edge of the table. We didn't just buy the building, sir. We bought the philosophy. We bought the right to decide what matters. And what matters? Arthur asked, looking up at them. You do, Marcus said. We want you to run it. Arthur blinked. Run what? The school, Sarah said. We want you to be the headmaster. No, not headmaster. That sounds too administrative. We want you to be the architect. I am a teacher, Arthur said, shaking his head vigorously. I told you, I don't want to sign checks. I don't want to deal with parents who think their child is the next Einstein. I want to be in the classroom. You will be, Marcus said. You can teach whatever you want, but you will also set the curriculum. You will hire the teachers. You will fire the ones who rely on multiple choice tests. You will bring back the metronomes and the debates and the ethics. I'm too old, Marcus, Arthur sighed, looking at his hands. The world has moved on. Look at this room. Look at those screens. I don't fit. The world hasn't moved on, Arthur, Elias said. It's just gotten noisier. It's forgotten the basics. Thinks faster is better. Thinks easier is better. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet bag. He opened it and took out an object. It wasn't a diamond or a key. It was a piece of chalk. A fresh, untouched stick of Hagoromo Full Touch. He placed it on the polished mahogany table, right in front of Arthur. The white dust stood out against the dark wood, a symbol of defiance. "The world is drowning in noise, sir," Marcus said softly. "We need someone to cut through it. We need someone to teach us how to slow down again." Arthur stared at the chalk. He thought of the thousands of lines he had written. Character, discipline, truth. He thought of Marcus stuttering. He thought of Elias angry. He thought of Sarah hiding. He looked up at them. He saw the adults they had become. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a root, deep, gnarled, hidden underground, but responsible for holding the tree upright against the storm. "I have conditions," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. Marcus smiled. "We expected nothing less." "No tablets in the freshman wing," Arthur said, sitting up straighter. "Done," Marcus said. "Mandatory philosophy for all seniors," Arthur added. "Agreed," Sarah nodded. And Arthur looked at Elias. "Detention is not sitting in a room. It is community service. Manual labor. They need to learn how to sweat." Elias grinned. "I'll order the scrub brushes myself." Arthur took a deep breath. He reached out and picked up the piece of chalk. Felt cool and solid in his hand. The weight of it was familiar. It was the weight of responsibility. He looked at the empty chair where Sterling had sat, then out the window at the rain. The storm was breaking. A sliver of pale, evening light was cutting through the clouds, illuminating the campus below. "Well," Arthur said, slipping the chalk into his pocket, "if I am to be the headmaster, I suppose I need to make a schedule change." "What's that?" Marcus asked. Arthur stood up. He didn't look frail anymore. He looked like the titan of room 304. "First period starts tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp," Arthur said. "And tell the janitors to bring the blackboards back up from the basement. We have a lot of work to do." The weekend that followed the hostile takeover of St. Jude Academy was not a time of rest. It was a time of deconstruction. Under normal circumstances, renovating a school took months of committee meetings and budget approvals. But Marcus King did not operate on committee time. He operated on the timeline of a man who could move logistics fleets with a single phone call. For 48 hours, the campus was a hive of activity, but not the kind the neighbors were used to. There were no deliveries of new computers or fiber optic cables. Instead, trucks arrived carrying heavy, rectangular slabs of slate harvested from a quarry in Vermont. Other trucks arrived to haul away the e-learning pods, the sleek, egg-shaped desks that had cost the school a fortune 5 years prior. By Monday morning, the rain had stopped, replaced by a crisp, biting wind that scoured the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. When the buses rolled up to the main entrance, the school looked the same from the outside. Stately brick, manicured ivy, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a heaviness in the air, a gravitational pull of expectation. Julian Vane sat in the back of his father's limousine, scrolling through TikTok. He was 16, with the soft hands of a boy who had never held anything heavier than a PlayStation controller and the arrogance of a boy who knew his last name was on the donor wall. He hadn't heard much about the takeover over the weekend. His father had been locked in the study with lawyers, drinking scotch and shouting into the phone. So Julian assumed it was just corporate noise. Nothing ever really changed for him. He was untouchable. The car stopped. "Have a good day, Master Julian," the driver said. "Yeah, whatever," Julian muttered, not looking up as he swung his backpack over one shoulder. He stepped out onto the curb, his eyes still glued to the screen, watching an influencer react to a spicy noodle challenge. He walked toward the entrance, merging with the stream of other students. He didn't notice the change until he hit the bottleneck at the main doors. Usually, students breezed through, tapping their ID badges against a scanner. Today, the scanners were covered with duct tape. Standing in front of the doors were 2 large metal bins, resembling industrial troughs. And standing behind the bins was Elias Thorne. The neurosurgeon was not wearing his white coat. He was wearing a dark suit that strained at the shoulders, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked less like a doctor and more like a bouncer at the gates of purgatory. Beside him stood Miller and the security team, looking nervous but resolute. "Phones," Elias rumbled. His voice carried over the chatter of the crowd, silencing it instantly. "Excuse me?" a senior girl with pink streaks in her hair asked, clutching her iPhone like a rosary. "We need them for our schedules. We have the app." "The app is deleted," Elias said calmly. "The schedules are printed on paper and posted on the bulletin board in the main hall. Phones go in the bin. You get them back at 3:30. "You can't do that," Julian shouted from the back of the pack, pushing his way forward. "That's my personal property. My dad says you can't confiscate personal property without a warrant." Elias looked down at Julian. He recognized the vain chin, the entitlement encoded in the boy's DNA. "Your dad isn't the principal anymore, Julian. Mr. Penden is. And this is a private institution. The new contract, which your parents received via courier yesterday morning, stipulates that by entering these grounds, you consent to a digital detox. Drop it, or go home." Julian hesitated. He looked around for support, but the other students were already complying, albeit with the sullen, terrified expressions of addicts being separated from their supply. The bins filled up with a clatter of glass and metal, thousands of dollars of technology discarded into a heap. Julian looked at Elias's face. It was granite. There was no negotiation there. With a sneer, Julian tossed his phone into the bin. It landed with a thud. He felt a phantom vibration in his pocket immediately, a ghost limb syndrome of the digital age. Inside, the school was unrecognizable. The silence was the first thing that hit them. There was no hum of server racks, no electronic beeping from the hallway monitors. The digital notice boards that usually flashed announcements were dark. In their place, actual corkboards had been mounted, covered in white sheets of paper pinned with red thumbtacks. But the real shock awaited them in the classrooms. Julian walked into his first period, history. He stopped in the doorway. The smartboard, the massive 70-inch touchscreen that had been the focal point of the room, was gone. In its place was a blackboard. It was jet black, pristine, and terrifyingly blank. The smell of the room had changed, too. The sterile scent of ozone was gone, replaced by the faint, dry aroma of chalk dust and floor wax. Mr. Arthur Penden stood at the front of the room. He was wearing a new suit, charcoal gray, gifted by Marcus, though he had insisted on keeping his old tie. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the students file in. He didn't say a word. He let them settle. He let them fidget. Without their phones, they didn't know what to do with their hands. They tapped their desks, they pulled at their cuticles, they looked at the ceiling. They were uncomfortable. "Good morning," Arthur said. "Good morning," a few students mumbled. "Stand up," Arthur commanded. The class looked at each other. They shuffled to their feet, chairs scraping loudly. "Good morning, Mr. Penden," Arthur said, projecting his voice to the back corners. "We will do this until you sound like you are alive. Good morning, class." "Good morning, Mr. Penden," they chorused, louder this time, driven by confusion and a primal instinct to obey the alpha in the room. "Sit." They sat. Arthur turned to the blackboard. He picked up a piece of the Hagoromo chalk. He didn't just write, he attacked the board. History of the Peloponnesian War. The sound was sharp, tactile. A tack-tack-tack that felt like a heartbeat. He turned back to them. "Open your textbooks to page 12. "We don't have textbooks," Julian said, slouching in his chair. "They were on the iPads. You took the iPads." "Look under your desks," Arthur said. Julian reached down. There, stacked on the wire rack, was a heavy, hardcover book. It smelled of old glue and paper. The history of the ancient world. It looked ancient. "That," Arthur said, "is a book. It does not run out of battery. It does not track your location. It does not interrupt you with notifications about what your ex-girlfriend is eating for lunch. Contains knowledge. Open it. The sound of 30 books opening was a rustle like dry leaves. For the next 45 minutes, Arthur continued, pacing the rows. We are going to talk about hubris. Does anyone know what hubris is? Silence. Google it. Someone whispered instinctively, then froze, realizing they couldn't. Hubris, Arthur said, stopping by Julian's desk, is the excessive pride or self-confidence that leads to a downfall. It is the belief that you are too big to fail. It is the belief that technology can replace thought. Athens had hubris. They thought their walls were high enough. They were wrong. He walked back to the board. Take notes. By hand. If I see a student not writing, they will stand for the remainder of the lesson. The scratching of pens on paper began. It was a messy, disjointed sound. These were hands that had swiped and tapped since birth. Cursive was a foreign language. Even printing was a chore. After 10 minutes, Julian's hand began to cramp. The muscles between his thumb and index finger burned. He dropped his pen. Keep writing, Mr. Vane, Arthur said without turning around. My hand hurts, Julian whined. This is archaic. Why can't we type? It's faster. Arthur spun around. Because when you type, you are transcribing. When you write, you are processing. The connection between the hand and the brain is sacred. You are physically carving the information into your memory. You are earning the knowledge, not just renting it. The rest of the day was a war of attrition. In the cafeteria, the healthy organic smoothie station, which was just sugar syrup, had been replaced by a hot line serving meatloaf and roasted vegetables. The vending machines were unplugged. The Wi-Fi was dead. By 3 p.m., the withdrawal was palpable. The students looked exhausted, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer mental load of being present for 7 hours. They couldn't zone out. They couldn't scroll. They had to look at people. They had to listen. But the real storm didn't happen inside the classrooms. It happened in the parking lot at pickup. The news of the Black Monday reforms had spread to the parents. The emails, sent from Sarah Jenkins's office, explaining the new Back to Basics initiative had landed in inboxes around noon. The reaction was nuclear. When the dismissal bell rang, the front lawn of St. Jude looked like a protest rally. A phalanx of angry mothers and fathers, men in finance vests and women in yoga gear, were gathered at the bottom of the steps. They were shouting. They were filming. Arthur walked out the front doors, flanked by Elias and Marcus. He stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at the mob. Where is he? Shouted a woman in the front row. It was Mrs. Vane, Julian's mother. She was holding her phone up, live streaming. This is abuse. You held my son incommunicado for 7 hours. I couldn't track his location. What if there was an emergency? Arthur stepped up to the microphone stand that Marcus had set up. He adjusted it. The feedback whine made the crowd wince. If there was an emergency, Mrs. Vane, Arthur said, his voice booming over the speakers. We have landlines in every classroom. We would have called you, just like schools did for 200 years before the invention of the iPhone. You took their property. Mr. Vane shouted, pushing to the front. You're trying to turn this place into a prison. We pay $50,000 a year for tuition. We pay for the best technology. And what has that technology bought you? Arthur asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded sad. He looked out at the crowd of wealthy, successful, anxious people. I looked at the data last night. Despite all your iPads and smartboards, reading comprehension at St. Jude has dropped 14% in 5 years. Anxiety diagnoses have tripled. We have students who can code in Python but cannot look a cashier in the eye to order a coffee. That's the world we live in. Mrs. Vane screamed. They need to be prepared for the digital economy. Marcus King stepped forward then. He moved comfortably into the light, the celebrity billionaire. A hush fell over the crowd. When Marcus King spoke, money listened. I built the digital economy, Marcus said softly. I wrote the code that keeps your kids addicted to their screens. I designed the algorithms that sell their attention to advertisers. He walked down a few steps, closer to the parents. And I am telling you, as the man who built the cage, you do not want your children living in it. I don't hire people who can use an iPad. I hire people who can think. I hire people who can focus for more than 15 seconds. Mr. Penden is not taking them back to the Stone Age. He is giving them a competitive advantage. He is giving them back their minds. And if we don't like it? Mr. Vane challenged, though his voice wavered. Then you can leave, Sarah Jenkins said, joining them. She stood tall, her senatorial pin glinting on her lapel. The wait list for St. Jude is 500 names long. We opened enrollment this morning for the waiting list under the new classical curriculum. We received 200 applications in 4 hours. People are hungry for this. If you want to withdraw Julian, Mr. Vane, the registrar is open until 5. We will refund your tuition pro rata. Mr. Vane looked at Sarah, then at Marcus, then at Arthur. He looked at the other parents. The anger was still there, but doubt was creeping in. Fear of missing out, FOMO, was a powerful drug for this demographic. If Marcus King thought this was the future, were they wrong? At that moment, the doors opened behind Arthur. The students poured out. They looked disheveled. They looked tired. But as they ran down the stairs to their parents, something strange happened. Julian Vane walked up to his father. He didn't have his phone yet. The bins were being unlocked at the gate. "Dad," Julian said. "Did they hurt you?" Mr. Vane asked, grabbing his son's shoulder. "Did they make you write with a quill?" "My hand hurts," Julian said, rubbing his thumb. "And Mr. Penden is a psycho." "We're pulling you out," Mrs. Vane said. "Right now." Julian paused. He looked back at the top of the stairs, where Arthur was standing. He remembered the class. He remembered the feeling of writing the word hubris. He remembered the moment in the silence of the room when he actually understood why Athens fell. It was a fleeting moment, but it had felt real. "No," Julian said. His parents froze. "What?" "No," Julian said, looking at his shoes. "Don't pull me out." "Why not?" "It's torture." "Because," Julian shrugged, struggling to articulate a feeling he didn't understand. "Because Brad Thorne dared me, I couldn't last a week. And I'm not gonna let that scholarship kid beat me." It was a lie mostly, but it was enough. The Vanes retreated to their limousine, confused and sullen. The protest dispersed, dissolving into individual conversations and the slamming of car doors. Arthur watched them go. He felt a heavy hand on his back. It was Elias. "Round 1 to us," Elias said. "It's not a fight, Elias," Arthur sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's a therapy session, and the patient is fighting the treatment." The weeks that followed were a grueling march. The restoration was not a montage of happy learning. It was a trench war. Arthur arrived at school every morning at 6:30 a.m. He stood at the front gate, greeting every student by name. He learned them all within a week. He checked uniforms. "Tuck in your shirt, Mr. Miller. Tie straight, Ms. Davis. Chin up, Mr. Vane." The resistance moved underground. Students started smuggling burner phones. Elias found them. He had an uncanny ability to spot a student concealing a device. A twitch of the eye, a protective hand over a pocket. He didn't get angry. He just held out his hand. "Bin." And into the bin they went. In the classrooms, the teachers struggled too. Many of the younger staff had never taught without a smartboard. They felt naked. Arthur held workshops every afternoon. "You are the visual aid," he told a young science teacher who was panicking about not having her animations. "Draw the cell on the board. Use your hands. Make them imagine the mitochondria. Imagination is a muscle. If you show them everything, they see nothing." Slowly, imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to thaw. It started in the cafeteria. Without phones to stare at, the noise level rose. First, it was complaints. But complaints required conversation. Students who had sat at the same table for 3 years without speaking were now united in their hatred of the new regime. "Penden is a fascist," Julian said one lunch, stabbing his meatloaf. "Total fascist," agreed a girl named Maya, who was the editor of the school paper. "But," Did you see the notes he wrote on your essay? Yeah, Julian grunted. Red ink everywhere. Looked like a murder scene. He actually read it though, Maya said, resting her chin on her hand. Mr. Sterling never read anything. He just used a keyword scanner. Penden circled my thesis statement and wrote weak logic, but strong voice. He called my voice strong. Julian looked at his own paper, folded in his pocket. Penden had written, "You have a sharp mind, Mr. Vane, but you are lazy. Prove me wrong." It infuriated him. It made him want to scream. It made him want to write a better essay. The breakthrough happened on a rainy Thursday in late November. Arthur was teaching the American Civil War. The rain was hammering against the windows, a rhythmic backdrop to the lesson. The classroom was warm, lit by the yellow glow of the pendant lights. Arthur was talking about the letter from Major Sullivan Ballou to his wife, written a week before the Battle of Bull Run. He didn't write on the board this time. He just stood in the center of the room and read the letter. "My very dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. If I do not return, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, and when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name." Arthur's voice was rough, weathered by age, but it held the emotion of the words with a reverence that silenced the room. He didn't act it out, he simply felt it. He finished reading. He placed the paper on his desk. "Sullivan Ballou was killed a week later," Arthur said softly. He never saw Sarah again. He looked at the class. There was no FaceTime. There was no text message. There was only this, ink on paper, a piece of his soul, carried by a horse across a burning country. Imagine the weight of that pen in his hand. Imagine the deliberation of every word, knowing it might be the last thing she ever hears from him. Arthur paused. That is the power of language. It is not content. It is not a caption. It is a bridge across death. He looked at Julian. Julian was staring at him. The boy's mouth was slightly open. For the first time in his life, Julian Vane wasn't thinking about his follower count. He was thinking about a man dying in a field in 1861. He was thinking about the permanence of ink. "Mr. Vane," Arthur said. Julian blinked, snapping back to the room. "Yes, sir? What would you write?" Arthur asked. "If you knew you had one page left, one page to leave to the world, what would you say?" The class held its breath. They expected Julian to make a joke, to say something about his crypto wallet or his sneakers. Julian looked down at his notebook. He looked at the cramping muscles of his hand. He looked at the blank page. "I don't know," Julian whispered. "That," Arthur said, "is the first honest thing you have said all semester." Arthur walked to the board and wrote a single assignment. Assignment. Write your last letter. To anyone. About anything. 500 words. Due tomorrow. Class dismissed. The bell rang. Usually it was a stampede. Today they moved slowly. They were quiet. As Julian packed his bag, he walked past Arthur's desk. He hesitated. "Mr. Penden?" "Yes, Julian?" Did she ever get the letter, Sarah?" "She did," Arthur said. "She kept it until the day she died." Julian nodded. He walked out into the hallway. He reached into his pocket for his phone. It was after 3:30, he had retrieved it. He pulled it out. The screen lit up with 50 notifications. Instagram, Snapchat, Discord. He looked at the screen. The colors seemed too bright, too artificial. The notifications felt trivial. "OMG, look at this cat. Party at Jason's. Buy one get one free." Julian thumbed the power button. The screen went black. He slid the phone back into his pocket without checking it. He had an essay to write. Arthur watched him go. He sat down in his chair, the heavy oak one. He was exhausted. His legs ached. His voice was tired. The door opened. Marcus poked his head in. "How was it?" Marcus asked. "We're getting there," Arthur said, rubbing his eyes. "We're getting there. I saw the Vane kid leave," Marcus said, stepping inside. He wasn't looking at his phone. "Small victories, Marcus." Arthur smiled faintly. Small victories. Marcus sat on the edge of the desk. We have a problem, though. Arthur looked up. The parents again? No, Marcus said, his face growing serious. The state. The audit on Sterling triggered something. The Department of Education is sending a review board next week. They're not happy about the unauthorized curriculum changes. They're threatening to pull our accreditation. Arthur sighed. He reached for his mug, the one Sarah had given him, now sitting proudly on his desk again. Let them come, Arthur said, taking a sip of lukewarm tea. I've handled bullies before. Sterling was a salesman. These bureaucrats, they're just paper tigers. They're bringing the superintendent, Marcus warned. Dr. Vance. He's a metric-obsessed technocrat. He hates you, Arthur. He wrote a paper 10 years ago calling traditional education child abuse. Arthur set the mug down. A glint of the old warhorse fire returned to his eyes. Dr. Vance? Arthur mused. I remember him. He was a student of mine in '85. He sat in the second row. Cheated on his midterm. Arthur stood up and picked up a fresh stick of chalk. If Dr. Vance wants to test my school, Arthur said, he'd better bring a number 2 pencil, because we don't do multiple choice here anymore. The snow that fell on St. Jude Academy in early December was not the picturesque dusting of sugar snow from a Christmas card. It was a heavy, industrial blanket of white that muffled the world. Inside the school, the silence was even more profound. It was the silence of deep work. 6 weeks into the restoration, the withdrawal symptoms from the digital detox had subsided, replaced by a strange, monastic focus. The hallways, once echoing with the tinny bleed of TikTok audio and frantic gossip, were now quiet enough to hear the hum of the heating pipes. Arthur Penden stood at the window of his office, the office that still smelled faintly of Sterling's espresso, though Arthur had done his best to colonize it with the scent of Earl Grey tea and old books. He watched the main gate. He was waiting. They're late, Elias Thorne said from the leather sofa. The neurosurgeon was reading a medical journal, but his leg was bouncing, a telltale sign of aggression he hadn't fully shed since his days as a brawler. Bureaucracy is never late, Elias, Arthur said without turning. It is merely delayed by its own weight. They will be here. Dr. Vance is a shark, Marcus King added. He was pacing the room, typing on a BlackBerry, the only concession to technology Arthur allowed in the inner sanctum, and only because Marcus was technically running a Fortune 500 company between classes. I've run the analytics on his tenure as superintendent. He's closed 14 schools in 3 years. He replaces them with magnet centers funded by edtech conglomerates. He calls it optimization. I call it strip mining. He was a cheater in 1985, Arthur murmured, his breath fogging the glass. And he is a cheater now. He doesn't care about education. He cares about the appearance of efficiency. As if summoned by the accusation, a fleet of white government sedans turned into the driveway. They didn't have the swagger of Marcus's private convoy. They had the cold, sterilized authority of the state. They moved in a line, parking strictly within the lines. Arthur buttoned his tweed jacket. He checked his pocket for his chalk, his talisman. Let's go meet the executioner. The meeting in the foyer was a study in contrasts. On one side stood the alumni. Marcus in his bespoke suit, Sarah Jenkins with her senatorial pin, and Elias Thorne, looming like a bodyguard. In front of them stood Arthur, fraying at the edges but solid as an oak root. Opposite them was the Department of Education delegation. They wore lanyards. They carried clipboards. They held tablets. And leading them was Dr. Gregory Vance. Vance had aged well in the way plastic ages, smooth, preserved, and slightly artificial. He wore a rimless pair of glasses and a suit that was too shiny. He looked at the school not with wonder, but with the critical eye of a health inspector looking for a rat. Arthur, Vance said. His voice was thin, reedy, devoid of warmth. He didn't offer a hand. Gregory, Arthur nodded. It's been 40 years. You still squint when you're calculating the odds. Vance's smile was tight. And you still wear that jacket. I suppose some things refuse to evolve. He gestured to his team. This is a compliance audit, Arthur. We are here to verify that St. Jude is adhering to the state core curriculum standards. We've received reports, disturbing reports, of deviations, unauthorized removal of technology, failure to utilize standardized testing software, regression to archaic methodologies. We call it teaching, Gregory, Arthur said. But you are welcome to look. The school is open. Oh, we will look, Vance said, tapping his tablet. We will look at everything. The inspection was a surgical dismantling. Vance and his team moved through the school like a virus. They entered classrooms without knocking. They stood in the back, tapping furiously on their screens, recording every violation. They walked into the biology lab. The smart tables were unplugged, pushed against the wall. In the center of the room, the students were dissecting frogs. Real frogs. The smell of formaldehyde was sharp. Where is the simulation software? Vance asked the teacher, a young woman named Ms. Halloway who Arthur had personally retrained. State guidelines recommend the BioSim 4.0 program. It's cleaner. It's more efficient. It's a video game, Ms. Halloway said, her hands gloved in latex. You can't learn the texture of a liver from a screen, Dr. Vance. You have to feel the resistance. Vance made a note on his tablet. Unsanitary conditions. Refusal to use approved materials. They moved to the library. The computer lab had been dismantled. In its place, Arthur had installed long wooden tables for communal reading. It was silent. 50 students were sitting there, reading books. Vance looked horrified. This is dead space, he muttered to his assistant. No data collection. No engagement metrics. How do we know they are reading? How do we track their eye movements? This is unquantifiable. They are reading the grapes of wrath, Arthur said, stepping up behind him. You don't track it, Gregory. You discuss it. You ask them why Rose of Sharon smiles at the end. Vance spun around. Stories don't get them into MIT, Arthur. Coding does. Data literacy does. You are crippling these children for a world that doesn't exist anymore. You are training them for 1950. I am training them to be human, Arthur said. Something the 21st century is trying very hard to cure. The tour ended in the auditorium. Vance stood on the stage, looking out at the empty seats. He checked his watch. He turned to Arthur, his face set in a grim line of bureaucratic finality. I've seen enough, Vance said. This isn't a school. It's a reenactment village. It's a nostalgia trip funded by a billionaire's guilt. He glanced at Marcus, who was leaning against the proscenium arch, arms crossed. I am revoking your accreditation, effective immediately. You have 30 days to cease operations or comply with the state digital mandate. That means tablets in every hand, biometric attendance tracking, and the reinstatement of the core metrics testing suite. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward. You can't do that, Vance. We have legal standing. We are a private institution. You receive state tax credits. Vance shot back, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who has read the fine print. And you grant diplomas recognized by the State Board of Regents. If I say those diplomas are worthless, they are worthless. Your students won't get into college. They won't get federal aid. You are finished. Arthur looked at Vance. He saw the gleam in his eye. It was the same look Vance had in 1985 when he had copied the answers to the calculus final onto the inside of his water bottle label. It was the arrogance of the shortcut. You want to shut us down, Arthur said quietly. Because we are an embarrassment to you. Because if we succeed, it proves that your optimization is a lie. It proves that you spent billions of taxpayer dollars on software that makes children dumber. I want to shut you down because you are dangerous, Vance hissed. You are selling a fantasy. You think you can just opt out of the future? You can't. The future is an algorithm, Arthur. Get on board or get run over. The future is not an algorithm, a voice said from the back of the stage. They all turned. It was Julian Vane. The boy had snuck into the auditorium. He was holding a stack of papers, handwritten essays. He looked different than the slouching, phone-addicted boy of 2 months ago. His blazer was buttoned. He stood straight. "Mr. Vane?" Arthur asked. "I was dropping off the essays for the Civil War unit," Julian said, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. He looked at Vance. "We're not dangerous. We're just thinking. I used to spend 6 hours a day on my phone. I couldn't focus on a movie, let alone a book. Now, I just read the Iliad. The whole thing. And I understood it." Vance laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "That's a charming anecdote, son. But anecdotes aren't data. I have charts that show student performance in digital classrooms outpaces traditional methods by 20% in standardized recall." "Recall isn't understanding," Julian shot back. "It is to the state," Vance said coldly. Arthur looked at Julian. He saw the fire. He looked at Marcus, Sarah, and Elias. He saw the outrage. And then an idea formed in his mind. It was reckless. It was old-fashioned. It was exactly the kind of thing Arthur Penden would do. "Data," Arthur said. "You want data, Gregory? It's the only thing that matters," Vance replied. "Fine," Arthur said. He walked to the center of the stage. "Then let's generate some." He turned to face the superintendent. "I challenge you." Vance blinked. "Excuse me?" "A wager," Arthur said. "You say your method is superior. You say your magnet centers with their iPads and their AI tutors produce better students. I say you're wrong. So let's prove it. Not with charts. Not with internal audits. With a test." "A standardized test?" Vance scoffed. "You don't believe in them." "No," Arthur said. "A competition. An academic decathlon. Old school. Public. Live." The room went silent. "You pick your best school," Arthur continued, his voice rising, filling the auditorium. "The flagship of your digital fleet. The one with the most funding, the most screens, the most optimization. You bring their top 10 students. I will bring my top 10 students. We will test them on history, literature, mathematics, science, and logic. No internet. No calculators. No multiple choice. Just questions and answers. Minds against machines." Vance stared at him. "You're insane. My flagship is the indistinctly named Tech Nexus. Their students are processing college-level calculus in the 10th grade. They have Neuralink study aids. You would be slaughtered." "Then you should have no problem accepting," Arthur said softly. "And the stakes?" Vance asked, his eyes narrowing. "If we lose," Arthur said, "I resign. Marcus sells the school to the state for $1. You can turn it into a server farm for all I care. We admit we were wrong." Sarah Jenkins gasped. "Arthur, you can't." Arthur held up a hand. "But if we win," he said, locking eyes with Vance. "You renew our accreditation for 10 years. You grant us total autonomy. And you publicly admit on camera that the analog method is valid." Vance looked at Arthur. He looked at the peeling paint on the auditorium walls. He looked at the dinosaur standing before him. In Vance's mind, this was a gift. It was a way to publicly humiliate Penden and the arrogant alumni who thought they could by the education system. It was a slam dunk. The data said so. Tech Nexus had an average IQ of 145. St. Jude was a rehabilitation center for rich slackers. "You have a death wish, Arthur," Vance smiled. "But I'm happy to grant it. Is that a yes?" Marcus King asked, stepping forward with his phone raised. "Because I'm live streaming this to 3 million people right now." Vance's smile faltered for a second, then returned, plastic and hard. He smoothed his tie. "It's a yes. 1 month. The state finals stage. Tech Nexus versus St. Jude. Prepare your retirement speech, Arthur." Vance turned and marched his team out of the auditorium. The heavy doors slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Sarah rushed to Arthur. "Arthur, are you out of your mind? Tech Nexus is a cyborg factory. They select students based on genetic aptitude. They use AI to cram information into their heads." "I know," Arthur said calmly. "We have Julian Vane," Elias pointed out, looking at the boy. "No offense, kid. But you thought the capital of France was Europe 2 months ago. Julian looked down, his face turning red. He knows better now, Arthur said, walking over to Julian and placing a hand on his shoulder. Don't you, Mr. Vane? Paris, Julian whispered. It's Paris. We have a month, Arthur said, turning to his alumni. Marcus, I need you to stop being a CEO and start being a math tutor. Sarah, you're taking the debate team. Elias, you have science. And you? Elias asked. What are you taking? Arthur looked at the empty seats of the auditorium. He imagined them filled. He imagined the pressure. He imagined the impossible odds. I am taking the rest, Arthur said. I am going to teach them how to lose their fear, because that is the one thing the machines can't do. A machine doesn't know what it means to be afraid, so it doesn't know what it means to be brave. We are going to win this not because we are smarter, but because we are hungrier. The next 30 days were not a montage. They were a crucible. St. Jude Academy went into lockdown. The school day was extended until 8 p.m. Saturday classes were mandatory. Sunday was for reading. The Decathlon 10 were selected. It was a motley crew. Julian Vane was there, surprisingly, for history. Maya, the editor, for literature. A quiet boy named David for math. A girl named Sam for science. They weren't the geniuses. They were the survivors of the detox. The training was brutal. Marcus King stood at a blackboard, covered in chalk dust, screaming about differential equations. Don't memorize the formula. Derive it. If you don't know why it works, you don't know it. Elias Thorne took the science team to the hospital morgue. This is a human brain, he said, holding a preserved specimen. It is the most complex computer in the universe. Respect it. Use it. Sarah Jenkins made the debate team argue against themselves. Switch sides, she would yell in the middle of a speech. Defend the opposition. If you can't understand your enemy's argument, you can't defeat it. And Arthur? Arthur was the ghost in the machine. He moved between the groups, correcting posture, whispering encouragement, demanding perfection. He didn't teach facts. He taught grit. One night, 3 days before the competition, the pressure broke. It was 9 p.m. The library was dimly lit. The team was exhausted. David, the math whiz, threw his pencil across the room. It's impossible, he shouted, burying his face in his hands. I saw the practice scores for Tech High. They're getting perfect scores. Every time. We're human. We forget things. We get tired. The room went silent. The fear that had been simmering under the surface boiled over. They were kids. They were fighting an algorithm. Arthur, who had been sitting in the corner grading papers, stood up. He walked over to David and picked up the pencil. You are right, David, Arthur said. You are human. You are flawed. You are inconsistent. He looked at the 10 students. They looked beaten. But that is why you will win. Arthur walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. A machine answers the question it is asked, Arthur said. It does not ask why the question matters. It does not make connections between a math formula and a poem. It does not have intuition. It has processing power. He turned back to them. In 1997, a computer beat the world chess champion Garry Kasparov. Everyone said it was the end of human intellect. But do you know what happened? People kept playing chess. Because the machine didn't care about the game. It just calculated the math. You care. Arthur leaned on the table. Dr. Vance thinks education is about downloading data. I think it is about constructing a soul. On that stage, when you don't know the answer, don't panic. Think. Use your logic. Use your heart. A machine cannot improvise. You can. He looked at Julian. Mr. Vane, why did Athens fall? Julian looked up. His eyes were tired, but clear. Hubris, Julian said. They thought their walls were high enough. They stopped looking at the world outside. Exactly, Arthur smiled. Dr. Vance has built a very high wall of technology. He thinks he is safe behind it. He thinks he has calculated every variable. Arthur snapped the pencil in half. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet library. He forgot the variable of the human spirit. Now pick up your books. We have work to do. The day of the decathlon arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The state finals were held at the convention center downtown, a massive glass cavern that felt more like an airport than an educational venue. The atmosphere was electric. The media was there in force. Marcus King had ensured that. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. They loved the narrative, the billionaire's experiment versus the state machine, old school versus new tech. The stage was set up like a boxing ring. On the left, Tech High Nexus. Their team looked like they had been 3D printed. They wore matching sleek silver uniforms. They sat perfectly still. They didn't talk to each other. They were plugged into tablets doing last-minute rapid-fire drills. On the right, St. Jude Academy. They wore their navy blazers, rumpled and comfortable. They looked nervous. They were talking, laughing nervously, tapping their feet. They looked like teenagers. In the front row of the audience sat Arthur Penden. He sat between Marcus and Elias. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at Dr. Vance, who sat on the opposite side, surrounded by aides, looking smug. The moderator, a famous news anchor, stepped to the podium. "Welcome," she said, her voice echoing through the hall, "to the State Academic Decathlon. Tonight we have a unique matchup, a battle of methodologies." The crowd cheered. The lights dimmed. "Round 1, the moderator announced. Mathematics. No calculators." The questions appeared on the massive screen. They were brutal. Complex calculus. Statistical probability. The Tech High students moved like robots. Their pens flew. They didn't hesitate. They finished in seconds. The St. Jude students were slower. David was chewing his lip. He was scratching out work in the margins. "Time," the moderator called. The scores flashed up. Tech High, 10 out of 10. St. Jude, 8 out of 10. A groan went up from the St. Jude section. Vance smirked and crossed his legs. Round 2, science, physics, chemistry, biology. Again, the speed of Tech High was terrifying. They regurgitated atomic weights and vector formulas as if they were reading from a database. St. Jude struggled. Sam missed a question about the specific enzymatic reaction in photosynthesis. She knew the concept, but forgot the Latin name. Score: Tech High, 20-20. St. Jude, 15/20. It was a massacre. "This is bad," Elias whispered, gripping the armrest until the leather creaked. "They're too fast, Arthur. They're encyclopedias." "Wait," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the stage. "The questions are factual. Wait for the logic." Round 3, literature and history, the moderator announced. "This round is different. These are essay questions. You have 5 minutes to answer verbally. The judges will score on accuracy, argumentation, and insight." This was it, the subjective round. The first question went to Tech High. A boy named Unit 734, or that was what he looked like, stood up. Question: Explain the significance of the green light in The Great Gatsby. The boy blinked. He began to speak. His voice was monotone. "The green light represents Gatsby's go-ahead signal. It is situated at the end of Daisy Buchanan's dock. It symbolizes the American dream and the unattainability of the past. It is mentioned in Chapter 1, Chapter 5, and Chapter 9. The color green is associated with money and envy." He sat down. It was perfect. It was accurate. It was Wikipedia recited by a human. The judges gave him a 9 out of 10. Now St. Jude. Maya stood up. She looked terrified. Question: In 1984, why does Winston Smith betray Julia? Maya took a breath. She looked at Arthur in the front row. He nodded. "He betrays her." Maya began, her voice gaining strength. "Not because he wants to, but because the system broke him. Orwell isn't writing about politics. He's writing about the fragility of love when it's faced with absolute pain. Winston betrays Julia to save himself from the rats. It proves that there is a limit to human loyalty when fear is absolute. It's the saddest moment in literature because it means the bad guys won inside his heart, not just in the world. The room was silent. The answer wasn't a list of facts. It was an interpretation. It was felt. The judges looked at each other. One of them wiped an eye. Score, 10 out of 10. The gap began to close. Round 4, logic. This was where the machines usually won. But the questions were tricky. They were paradoxes. Tech stumbled. When asked a moral dilemma, is it right to steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving family? The Tech student got stuck in a loop of legal statutes. Theft is a crime under Penal Code 484. Therefore, it is incorrect. 0 points for empathy. St. Jude's Julian Vane stood up. It's illegal, he said. But it's moral. The law is black and white, but life is gray. You save the family, then you face the judge. That's what responsibility means. The score was tied. 45-45. Final round. Sudden death. One representative from each team. Vance looked nervous. He was whispering frantically to his aides. Arthur sat back. He unbuttoned his jacket. For the final round, the moderator said, "We have a complex scenario. Please welcome Mr. Julian Vane for St. Jude and Mr. Alex Chun for Tech High." The two boys walked to the center podium. Alex Chun looked like a computer processing unit in human skin. Julian Vane looked like a kid who had learned the hard way. The question, the moderator said, is from the field of ethics and history. A leader is losing a war. He has a weapon that can end the war instantly, saving 1 million of his own soldiers, but it will kill 200,000 innocent civilians of the enemy nation. He uses the weapon. Was he right? Defend your position. It was the Hiroshima question, the ultimate unsolvable equation. Alex Chun buzzed in immediately. Based on utilitarian calculus, Alex droned. The decision is correct. 1 million lives saved is numerically greater than 200,000 lives lost. The net positive is 800,000 lives. Therefore, the action is optimal. He looked at the judges, expecting the points. It was the logical answer, the algorithmic answer. The moderator turned to Julian. Mr. Vane? Rebuttal? Julian stood there. He thought about the letter from Sullivan Ballou. He thought about the men dying in the field. He thought about the civilians. He didn't look at the judges. He looked at Alex. The math is right, Julian said softly. But the answer is wrong. The crowd murmured. Explain, the moderator said. You can't do math with people, Julian said, his voice rising. They aren't numbers. If you say it's optimal to kill 200,000 people, you lose your humanity. Maybe he had to do it. Maybe it was the only choice. But he wasn't right. He was tragic. A leader who makes that choice should never sleep again. If we call it optimal, we make it easy to do it again. And that is hubris. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. It wasn't a textbook answer. It wasn't correct, in the sense of a multiple-choice key. But it was wise. It was the kind of wisdom that only comes from reading old books and listening to old men. The head judge, a professor of ethics from Yale, leaned forward. He picked up his microphone. Mr. Chun gave the answer of a general, the judge said. Mr. Vane gave the answer of a president. Point. St. Jude. The scoreboard clicked. St. Jude, 46. Tech High, 45. Winner. St. Jude Academy. Pandemonium. The St. Jude students leaped from their seats. Marcus King punched the air. Sarah Jenkins screamed. Elias Thorne lifted Arthur Penden off the ground in a bear hug that nearly cracked the old man's ribs. Arthur laughed. It was a rusty sound, unused for years, but it came out full and loud. He looked across the aisle. Dr. Vance was sitting perfectly still. He looked at the scoreboard. He looked at his optimized students who were confused, unable to process the error in their calculation. Arthur walked over to him. The cameras followed. Vance looked up, his face pale. You cheated, Vance whispered. You coached them on emotion. I taught them, Arthur said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the piece of chalk, the one he had carried all day. Take it, Gregory. He placed the chalk in Vance's limp hand. Go back to your office. Take down the charts. And write this on the board. Not everything that counts can be counted. Arthur turned and walked away, toward his students who were chanting his name. Penden, Penden, Penden. He was surrounded by them. Julian Vane was crying, holding the trophy. We did it, Mr. Penden. Julian sobbed. We beat the machines. Arthur smiled, wiping a speck of dust from his eye. You are the machines, Julian, Arthur whispered. The most beautiful, broken, brilliant machines ever built. The seasons at St. Jude Academy did not pass in the flicker of digital calendars or the automatic updates of a weather app. They passed in the turning of the leaves on the great oaks that lined the driveway, and in the shifting angle of the sunlight that filtered through the high, arched windows of room 304. 5 years had passed since the Great Decathlon. 5 years since the analog revolution had begun. The world outside the brick walls of the academy had continued its frantic acceleration into the ether. The metaverse had risen and fallen. AI assistants had become AI companions. Schools across the country had replaced teachers with holographic tutors that never tired and never frowned. But St. Jude stood apart, a fortress of solitude in a sea of noise. It had become a legend, a pilgrimage site for desperate parents who watched their children vanishing into screens and wanted to pull them back to the shore of the Real. The waiting list was no longer hundreds long. It was thousands. To get into St. Jude was not just an academic achievement. It was a rescue mission. Arthur Penden sat in his office, the leather of his chair groaning softly as he shifted his weight. At 70 years old, the iron in his spine had not melted, but it had rusted. His movements were slower now, deliberate, measured by the rhythm of a cane carved from black walnut, a gift from the woodshop class of 2028. He looked out the window. It was autumn again. The campus was alive, but it was a quiet life. There were no students hunching over phones in the courtyard. Instead, they sat in circles on the grass, debating philosophy. A group of sophomores was playing chess on a stone table. A junior was reading poetry aloud to a freshman. It looked like a scene from a forgotten era, a preserved memory of what humanity used to look like before it wired itself to the hive. You're staring again, Arthur? A voice said from the doorway. Arthur turned. It was Marcus King. The billionaire looked different, too. The sharp edges of his corporate armor had softened. He wore a cashmere sweater instead of a suit, and the gray at his temples matched the slate of the blackboards. He visited the school once a week, not as a donor, but as a guest lecturer in applied ethics. I am not staring, Marcus, Arthur rasped, his voice a little thinner than the boom that had once terrified hallways. I am inspecting. There is a difference. And what does the inspection reveal? Marcus asked, walking in and pouring himself a cup of tea from the pot that always sat on Arthur's desk. That the grass needs cutting, Arthur grunted, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. And that Mr. Vane is late for his third-period history class. Julian is never late, Marcus corrected, sitting down. He's just thorough. He was probably explaining the causes of the French Revolution to a squirrel. They both laughed. It was a comfortable sound, born of battles fought and won together. Julian Vane, the boy who had once tried to define the world by its efficiency, had returned to St. Jude after graduating from Yale with highest honors. He had turned down job offers from Goldman Sachs and Google. He had walked into Arthur's office 3 years ago, placed his diploma on the desk and said, I want to teach. Arthur had hired him on the spot, assigning him to room 302 right next door. How are you feeling, Arthur? Marcus asked, the levity fading from his voice. Arthur waved a hand dismissively. I am fine. My doctor tells me my heart is tired. I told him it has every right to be. It has been beating for thousands of children for 50 years. Let it be tired. Sarah is worried, Marcus said. She wants you to see a specialist in Zurich. Elias can arrange it. No Zurich, Arthur said firmly. And tell Elias to stop trying to biohack me. I am not a server that needs upgrading. I am a library book that is reaching its due date. It is the natural order. He stood up, leaning heavily on the cane.
Come?
Walk with me. The bell is about to ring. They walked into the hallway. The walls were lined not with digital displays, but with framed essays, the best handwritten work from the last 5 years. They walked past the trophy case, where the dusty cup from the academic decathlon sat front and center, polished to a shine by the janitor who knew exactly what it meant. As they walked, the bell rang. It was an actual brass bell, rung by a student monitor in the main hall. The doors flew open. The flood of students was a sea of navy blue. But when they saw Arthur, the sea parted. "Good morning, Headmaster Penden," they said as they passed. "Good morning." Arthur nodded to them. "Tuck that shirt in, Mr. Roberts. Ms. Lee, excellent point on the debate floor yesterday." He knew them all. He knew their names, their fears, their potential. He was the grandfather of this tribe. They reached room 304. The door was open. Inside, the classroom was empty, waiting for the next period. Arthur walked in. He ran his hand along the front row of desks. He touched the blackboard. "Do you remember, Marcus?" Arthur asked softly. "The rain? The box?" "I remember every second," Marcus said, standing in the doorway. "I remember thinking you looked like a king in exile. I was a frightened old man," Arthur admitted, turning to look at his former student. "I thought I had failed. I thought the world didn't want what I had to sell anymore." "The world didn't know it needed it," Marcus said. "Until you reminded them." Arthur sat down at his old teacher's desk. He looked at the empty room, but in his mind, it was full. He saw Marcus stuttering in the third row. He saw Elias scowling in the back. He saw Sarah standing on the chair. He saw Julian crying over a letter from the Civil War. "I am retiring, Marcus," Arthur said. The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. Marcus didn't look surprised, but his shoulders sagged slightly. "When?" "Today. Now." "But the semester isn't over," Marcus said. "The students are ready," Arthur said. "And so is the school. I have built the foundation. You, Sarah, Elias, you are the walls. But the roof needs to be someone young enough to keep the rain out for the next 50 years. "Julian?" Marcus asked. Arthur nodded. "He has the fire. He has the scar tissue. He understands that teaching is not a job. It is a priesthood." Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out his box of chalk, the Hagoromo Full Touch. There was only one stick left, a pristine cylinder of white. He placed it on the desk. "Take me home, Marcus," Arthur whispered. "I'm tired." The decline was not a cliff. It was a gentle slope. Arthur Penden did not die in a hospital. He refused. He died in his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of books and the smell of Earl Grey tea. For 2 weeks, a vigil was held. Not a sad one, but a triumphant one. Sarah Jenkins, now the governor of the state, took a leave of absence to sit by his bedside and read to him. She read the Federalist Papers. She read To Kill a Mockingbird. Elias Thorne, the man whose hands saved lives, spent his evenings massaging Arthur's atrophied muscles, telling him stories about the patients he had healed using the focus he learned in detention. Marcus King sat in the corner, working on a laptop, simply existing in the same space, guarding the man who had guarded him. And Julian Vane came every day after school. He brought papers to grade. He sat by the bed and asked for advice. "The Johnson boy is acting out," Julian would say. "He's brilliant but angry. Give him a scrub brush," Arthur would whisper, his eyes closed. "Anger is just energy with no direction. Give it a job." On a Tuesday evening in November, the snow began to fall again. It swirled outside the window, blanketing the city in silence. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at the 3 titans sitting around him, the billionaire, the governor, the surgeon, the children of room 304. "You did good," Arthur whispered. His voice was a dry leaf skittering on pavement. "We had a good teacher," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, though her voice remained steady. "Don't let them. Bring back the machines," Arthur said. It was a command. "Never," Elias vowed. "Over my dead body." Arthur smiled. He looked at the ceiling, but he didn't see plaster. He saw the faces of 5,000 children. He saw the aha moments. He saw the light bulbs turning on in dark rooms. Class dismissed. Arthur breathed. And then the great teacher stopped. The funeral of Arthur Penden was not a local event. It was a national phenomenon. The cathedral was not big enough. The procession wound through the streets of the city, miles long. They came from everywhere. CEOs flew in from Tokyo and London. Senators arrived from Washington. Artists, mechanics, doctors, writers, people of every race, every age, every background. They were the alumni of the chalk. They were the people Arthur Penden had molded, one detention, one lecture, one hard truth at a time. But the most striking image was not the dignitaries. It was the hearse. As the black car moved slowly toward St. Jude Academy, his final resting place in the small cemetery on the hill behind the football field, it did not drive through a shower of flowers. It drove through a white cloud. The students of St. Jude, past and present, lined the road. Thousands of them. And in their hands they held pieces of chalk. As the hearse passed, they didn't throw them. They ground them together. Clap, clap, clap. Clouds of white dust rose into the air, swirling in the wind, coating the hearse, coating the street, coating the world in a fine, white powder. It was the dust of labor, the dust of knowledge, the dust of the arena. When they reached the grave, there was no eulogy. There were no speeches. What could be said that hadn't been written on the lives of the people standing there? Marcus King stepped forward. He held the wooden box from Arthur's desk, the banana box. He placed it gently into the grave. Then he took a single piece of chalk. He broke it in half. Snap. He dropped the broken pieces onto the coffin. "Thank you," Marcus whispered. One by one, the crowd followed. Sarah, Elias, Julian, then the students. They dropped their broken chalk. Soon the coffin was covered. Not in dirt, but in a mound of white, a mountain of calcium carbonate, a monument to the tools of the trade. The following Monday, room 304, the sun was shining, reflecting off the snow outside, filling the room with a blinding, purifying light. The desk was empty. The chair was pushed in. The 30 students of the sophomore honors history class sat in silence. They were waiting. They looked at the empty desk with a sense of reverence and fear. They knew who had sat there. They knew the shoes that had to be filled. The door opened. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a statue. It was a young man. He wore a tweed jacket, a little too big for him, perhaps purchased from a vintage store in Homage. He carried a leather satchel. He walked with a slight limp, the result of a skiing accident years ago, but his posture was upright, defiant. Julian Vane walked to the front of the room. He placed his satchel on the desk. He looked at the students. He saw the same fear he had once felt. He saw the same potential. He turned to the blackboard. It had been washed clean, a black void waiting for a universe to be created upon it. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a piece of chalk. Not a stylus, not a laser, piece of chalk. He held it up. The sunlight caught the white tip. He turned to the board. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The sound was sharp, familiar, eternal. He wrote a single word, in large, block letters. Legacy. He turned back to the class. His eyes were wet, but his voice was strong. It was the voice of the empire. "My name is Mr. Vane," he said. "Put away your fears. We have work to do." He looked at the empty chair in the corner, and for a split second he saw him. Arthur Penden, nodding, a phantom smile on his face, tapping his watch. Julian smiled back. "Open your books," Julian commanded. Page 1. The sound of 30 books opening filled the room. It was the sound of wings flapping. It was the sound of the future being written, one hand, one mind, one piece of chalk at a time.